And so there's a lot of discussion of like, do we collect race, gender? Do we collect sex, gender? Do we collect data about gender at all? And I think behind those sorts of fraught questions, there's really a concern that the collection of such data can really engage in one of two harms. In a sense, we can like get it wrong. So we can sort of end up with a representation of a social category that's false in some significant sense. And indeed not just sort of represent that category falsely, but then act on that false representation in a materially harmful way. So, some of the conversations talked about like, you have this representation of race and that results in a lot of people not getting the kidney treatments that they need, right? So we're sort of acting back on that false representation. Relatedly, if you represent people of a marginalized category, which Ari's conversation or talk kind of touched on, you're sort of engaging in a form of visibility that could put those people in a real position of vulnerability. So you can sort of increase their risk of a more considered form of injustice, give people the information they need to target groups and engage in discrimination or racism or gender-based violence. But on the other hand, we kind of had some great comments from Nancy today about kind of the central tenet of social science, which is the idea that in order to change the world, to improve it, to make it more just and less unequal, we have to apprehend our current social conditions. How categories of difference are reliably rendered and acted on to make them categories of subordination, and know the specificities of how those conditions are materialized in our world if we ever want to work to alter the character of those relations. And I think really central to that question is this notion of datification. So what do I mean when I say that we're sort of like datifying a great deal of our social world? I think we're rendering a lot of how we interact and behave as we move, shop, work, sleep, watch TV, learn. A lot of those sorts of human behaviors are now being rendered in digital form. And I'll just give a little example. Like if I go to the coffee shop at 116th and Broadway across the street from Columbia, and I buy coffee and I pay for it in cash. I can pay for my coffee with cash, so I can walk into the store and pay with cash. Or I can take out my phone with like my little Apple Pay and tap it on Square, and all of a sudden that interaction is the same interaction has been datified. So what I mean by that? The information on the purchaser, me, the seller, Joe Coffee, the time that I purchased, what I purchased, and for how much, has all been datified. It's rendered as pieces of digital information. And this endows it with certain properties. That means that we can sort of extend the insights of that exchange. It's extendable across time. It's extendable across subjects. It's composable with pieces of information about other people and other transactions. And with these properties, I can disaggregate. So when I bought the coffee, who I am, what coffee I bought, I can recombine all of that with the data of other people along relevant shared features that are both directly observed, like other morning coffee buyers at Joe Coffee at 116th and Broadway, or inferred, other people who are also likely live in my neighborhood. And these features about my purchase of coffee in the morning are sort of abstracted from the initial social exchange. And in this sort of disaggregate form, this information that can be reaggregated and combined and used to train models and used to develop inferences, it sort of takes on a life of its own. And, that's a lot of what we're up to these days. So 17 years ago, we sequenced the first human genome. That took about 3 gigabytes of data, which is about a DVD's worth of data. As of April 2020, which is an old statistic now, 23andMe claimed it had more than 10 million customers. So that's a whole lot more genetic data. And the latest autonomous vehicles, they produce up to 30 terabytes for every 8 hours of driving. So we're producing a lot of data about people moving about in the world, as this slide sort of shows. So what does the law have to do with all of this? And this is, my slide's a little cut off. I mean, it's not that important, but let me know if it causes a real comprehension issue. I think the slide just says, like, what is the role in sort of structuring all of this? And that's really a question of how do we assign legal rights and obligation regarding data about people. So how does our current way of structuring legal rights regarding data production correspond to the kinds of legal concerns raised by this production who can assert claims regarding the data production process. So who's granted legal standing to have a say in data production and the processes and priorities of this enterprise? And what are the kinds of legal claims, like the character of the interest that we think that they have? And the meta question here is, how do we assign rights and obligations using law to encourage socially beneficial data production and minimize socially harmful data production? So there's kind of two responses to all of this data production happening and the ways that it can harm people but also benefit people. The first is kind of like a Propertarian theory of what makes datification potentially harmful. And so here the notion is that we are sort of exchanging valuable data for services under wrongful conditions of sort of unjust enrichment, that this is a sort of massive value extraction enterprise where we're providing an incredibly valuable resource that is making very large companies very wealthy, and we're kind of in this condition where we're like serfs. We're just laboring for these large platforms. They're sucking up all of that value. We're not getting any slice of the pie. And so the kind of response to this from a legal perspective is to give people a right to payment. So there's kind of this quantitative issue that companies are getting rich, and the response is to reallocate some claim to this value creation, this wealth creation, in the form of granting data subjects a property or a wage right. So they're able to command some portion of that wealth creation as a wage or as a sort of a propertized claim that they can then go exchange in a market with other platforms to sort of command a fair price for their data. And that's kind of quite a minority view in law. There are people who overwhelmingly propose that population. Far more prevalent in law is this kind of dignitary or surveillance account of what makes datification wrongful. And dignitarians would say that payment at the point of collection does absolutely nothing to obviate the harm of datification. They don't think of it as a quantitative insufficiency where we're not getting enough of the pie. They think of it as a dignitary, kind of a qualitative harm. And the idea here is that privacy, or sort of our ability to decide whether or not we're going to be rendered legible and on which terms, is kind of a core good necessary for the law to secure in order for us to sort of preserve the sphere of autonomy in which we can cultivate our sense of self and sort of develop enough of a sense of autonomy and agency that we can then go enact that agency and that will in the world. So it's sort of a core protection needed to develop that sense of self. And this is a very old basis of privacy. This is kind of the right to be let alone that Brandeis first wrote about in 1895. He went on to become a Supreme Court justice in the United States. And it was his sort of conception of privacy as a right to be let alone that led to sort of the US approach to privacy that we still really live with today. And so the idea of the harm here is that it's a legibility harm. There's kind of this excessive apprehension that knowing me in a way that I did not meaningfully consent to is sort of violating this capacity for me to enjoy that privileged relationship to myself. And on this account, that's not the end of what could go wrong. Even worse, that barrier that allowed me to sort of manage the terms of being let alone, once it's broken, I'm kind of denied the necessary space I need to cultivate my own sense of my own preferences, what I in fact want to do, how I in fact want to act on the world, and I can be sort of acted back on in a way that might substitute the will or the preference of the watcher for my own, had my barrier of sort of self-formation been preserved. And so these are sort of the accounts of how sort of excessive apprehension or legibility can lead to concerns of manipulation, undermining my autonomy. And so, much like the rights of payment people, they sort of had a legal response for the data subject. They're going down with a property right. The response here is to really shore up this sort of dignitary or privacy right. So the response is to sort of thicken that barrier against the excessive surveillance and really shore up our privacy rights. And this sort of takes two forms. One is to sort of increase the threshold for what counts as consent, to be very sure that if I'm sort of letting someone into my little house, I really mean it, and that I've not been like dark patterned into giving consent that I do not in fact give. But it also tends to correspond to legal claims that don't extinguish at that initial point of collection, but if data about me is being collected, I'm also vested with downstream rights that I can continue to exercise with respect to how that data collected about me can be used to infer or make decisions about me, which is also really trying to get at this point that information collected about me, the way I'm being rendered legible and apprehended, won't be used to sort of undermine core notions of myself and my autonomy. But I think these accounts are compelling. They're really capturing something about what makes datafication wrongful, but I think they're incomplete, and maybe even inaccurate accounts of what makes datafication wrongful, and how in turn law ought to assign rights to people over data about people. I'm going to use a timely example here. So we have a data subject here, Anna. Anna is 4 weeks pregnant, and ever since Anna began trying to become pregnant, she's been using this fertility tracking app called Apricot. And she's been uploading information on her ovulation cycle, eating habits, exercise patterns, sleep, mood changes, a range of other physical symptoms. Apricot aggregates and synthesizes all this data that users are sharing. Not to sell people's data directly, which they reassure their users they would never do, but to sort of derive insights and to, in turn, sort of partner with a number of other actors to sort of sell the insights about their user base to clients, like advertisers, employment consultancies, consumer credit agencies, and so on and so forth. And this makes Apricot a lot of money because early pregnancy data is very valuable. Having a child is a big event in a consumer's life. It's when Anna is likely to change all kinds of behaviors. She's going to change brand loyalty. She's going to change the store she shops at. So advertisers are very keen to be the first to get to her in this state of flux. But as we all know, this kind of lucrative time in Anna's life is also a very risky one. The legal status of Anna's first trimester pregnancy and her decisions about whether or not to stay pregnant are extremely personally and legally fraught, particularly in the United States right now. So we can sort of understand that there's like a benefit and a risk here. And first trimester pregnancy can make someone vulnerable in other ways too. So potential or current employers, creditors, insurers, they might also be interested in knowing not necessarily who's pregnant, but who's likely to experience an expensive and disruptive life event that might make them no longer a part of the workforce or might make them a really expensive person to insure. Which is not to say that any of those entities want to specifically target or identify pregnant people, but that those entities might be interested in optimizing for low-cost, low-risk people to enter into the workforce or to insure. And you know, our sort of previous slides about datafication and sort of privacy law, they're attentive to this risk. Oh, did I go to? Not yet, okay. So let's imagine we adopt one or both of those sorts of accounts that I had just provided. And I'm going to focus on the Dignitarian one since that's mainly what laws do. So we give Anna really robust consent requirement. We impose a really robust consent requirement on Apricot, so they have to get Anna's consent and like she has to really mean it. And we impose certain conditions on how that data can be used about her, such that like she retains certain downstream rights against how this information about her can be used. But of course, that's not actually how data about people gets used in the real world, because we have people all over our world who are like Becca here. So Becca does not use Apricot, but she fits the behavioral patterns that emerge from the analysis of Apricot users. So like Anna and others, she exhibits the same patterns. And sometimes those can be patterns that aren't even sort of directly from Apricot. They can arrive from the aggregation of other data. So she exhibits the same patterns of changed TV viewing and online purchasing behaviors that indicates that she is also likely to be in the first trimester of a pregnancy. So the problem from a legal perspective is that the rights we've given Anna over her relationship with Apricot does not correspond to this sort of relationship between Anna and Becca. And this relationship between Anna and Becca we can think of as like a horizontal relation or a data relation, which is getting at the idea that data collected from Anna is almost never just about Anna in the way that that data is actually used to like make companies money in the digital economy, right? It's almost always also about others that share relevant population features with Anna, like Becca. And this kind of speaks to or expresses the basic fact of our sociality, that we're like one another, that people like me can reveal meaningful things about me that are economically and socially useful. And that's kind of coupled with technological capacities, more processing power, machine learning methods that allow us to make sense of that sociality at scale and in an economically feasible way. And so the point here is that these sort of relationships between Anna and Becca are really key to how data about people get used to derive insights. But they're not how the law thinks about the rights that we have in data. And to make things a little bit more complicated for our legal account, these horizontal relations, they're sort of population-level relations arising from those population correlations. So Anna is in a horizontal relation with not just Becca, but potentially like all the Beccas in population J that share relevant pregnancy-indicating features with her. And the same is true the other way around. And so what this means from a legal perspective is that these horizontal ties, they give rise to a population interest, a population legal interest. So insofar as either Becca or Anna have some legally protected interest in how pregnancy data is used to make decisions about them, that legal interest attaches or is implicated or is accrued at the population level. It's implicated by the choices of anyone who shares indicia of this population feature. So this kind of has like three upshots for data governance law. The first is that attaching consent rights or sort of control at the point of collection just doesn't really make sense or operationalize its own account of what makes datafication wrongful. So even if all we care about is like, you know, not being surveilled or not being acted on in a way that might manipulate you or put you at risk, that just doesn't correspond to consent. The way consent works in the law is that I can't consent on behalf of another and they can't consent on behalf of me. But because these are population level interests, that's just happening irreducibly all the time, which is a problem for consent. The second that I'm going to kind of run through quickly is that we're not indexing a lot of the ways in which datafication might be considered wrongful, which is not necessarily because of this sort of interpersonal violation of my sphere of autonomy, but because the data relations being apprehended between the Annas and Beccas of the world are being acted on in a subordinating way, which is a different account from like the violation of autonomy, sort of piercing my sphere of autonomy account. It's really trying to get at how I am drafted into the project of subordinating others like me as a condition of being a social being in the digital world. And, you know, I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more in Q&A, but the idea basically is like this Kianga Yamada-Taylor tweet, who's just like right about everything all the time, talking about in the aftermath of Dobbs that, you know, SCOTUS has effectively created a new tier of citizenship and belonging to which it's consigned nearly half the population. Without the right to control your reproduction, the social, economic, and political status of women will change. So part of how we are constituted as a group of people as women is like we have to control the means of reproduction in order to be in a position of equal economic, political, and social standing. That's sort of a condition that is required. And indeed, making this a central part of women's identity, sort of conscripting them into motherhood is like the point of altering the legal rights to advance a conception of women as people who can be drafted into this account. So this is a lawyer for a pro-life group talking about a 10-year-old girl being forced to carry a pregnancy to term. So part of what we are doing when we datify indicia of fertility and use them to infer, predict, or guide human behavior is to act on one relation among women or people who can carry children that helps materialize or constitute the category of difference. And we can act on that information in a subordinating way or in an empowering way. But that is a different account of what makes datafication potentially wrongful than just the autonomy account. I think I'm short on time. I'll just sort of quickly point out that this sort of missing legal account can also prevent socially beneficial data production. And I want to just quickly point out here that if we grant strong claims to individual people, those strong negative rights don't just apply to the legal subjects we like. We can also prevent data collection that might apply to polluters or employers that are reliably engaging in wage theft or abusive landlords or discriminatory employers. And I'll just quickly give the cautionary tale of the First Amendment, which Cohen v. California was this 1971 landmark case that really expanded our First Amendment protections, led to a long run of expanded First Amendment rights, but not just hippies and draft dodgers who were using the First Amendment to vindicate rights against the state. It also really got co-opted by companies to try to sort of break down the capacity for the state to regulate and oversee activity. So again, just sort of a cautionary tale of giving strong negative rights at the point of collection. I think there are a lot of parallels to draw with privacy rights today. Okay, hopefully not too over time. Thank you.